The last time the convent bells rang, it was a sound that echoed through the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees trembled in the chilly autumn breeze. Inside a weathered chapel, a small group of nuns gathered, their prayers rising beneath faded frescoes. The saints painted on those walls had lost their faces to time and sorrow. Out on the horizon, flames flickered. Ottoman banners, red as fire, were already visible, fluttering like sparks across the mountains. The women inside knew exactly what that meant. No messengers came from the nearby villages. No soldiers remained to defend them. Only a heavy, expectant silence hung in the air, the calm before the storm. At the altar stood their abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, clutching a silver crucifix that had survived 100 years of storms. She whispered to her sisters, "If they break through our walls, keep your vows in your hearts, where no one can steal them." But history would prove her wrong. When the empire's armies reached the convent gates, vows and prayers were no match for what was coming. If you're fascinated by real stories from the Ottoman Byzantine frontiers, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us dig up more hidden accounts from old archives, missionary letters, and Vatican reports. Now, let's get back to the story. Before the sun set, the first stones of the convent began to fall. The hymns that once filled those halls were drowned out by the roar of iron and the cries of the conquered. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They blasted the gates open with cannon fire, making it clear that nothing was sacred. To them, a convent wasn't a sanctuary. It was a symbol of resistance, a sign that the cross still dared to stand on conquered land. Inside, the sisters hid their most precious relics: silver chalices, embroidered icons, even fragments of saints' bones buried beneath the chapel floor. They hoped that if their bodies were lost, their faith might survive. But the soldiers weren't looking for treasure. They wanted proof that they had crushed not just an army, but a god. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were rounded up in the courtyard. Torchlight turned their white robes into shifting gold and shadow. The soldiers told them they'd be brought before the pasha, a promise that, for most, meant little hope. What happened next became legend, so grim that even church scribes avoided the details. By dawn, the convent was nothing but ash. Smoke drifted from the refectory where the women once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags now flew from the bell tower, signaling to nearby troops that the resistance was over. But in that courtyard, something unexpected happened. The soldiers, waiting for screams, heard singing instead. Bound with ropes, the surviving sisters began to chant, not a hymn of despair, but one of defiance, the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices shook, but they did not break. The Ottoman captain, unsure whether to laugh or silence them, ordered the abbess brought forward. Eleni still clung to her silver cross. The captain offered her mercy, renounce her faith and accept the conqueror's God, and her sisters would be spared. Her answer sealed her fate. "I have already given my life. What more can you take?" The captain hesitated, perhaps moved, then turned away, leaving her to his men. What happened after was never fully recorded. Even Ottoman accounts, which usually celebrated victory, described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. Yet, in later European letters, her name reappeared. Eleni of Lissa, the nun who would not kneel. By midday, the convent's bells had been melted down for coin, and the rooftop cross shipped east as a trophy. But soon, rumours spread through the villages. They said that when the wind swept through the ruins at night, you could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely cleared when the march began. What was left of the order, 22 women in torn habits, were forced south toward the coast, their ankles bound, watched by Ottoman horsemen. They weren't prisoners of war, but living symbols of conquest, proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was brutal. The sun beat down on the road. The sisters, who had never left their cloister, stumbled from thirst and exhaustion. When one fell, another lifted her veil so the soldiers wouldn't trample it. A final act of dignity in a world stripped of mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her last words lived on. If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other. After 7 days of walking, the captives reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships built for control, not comfort. The women were herded aboard, wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves once sat. As the sails filled, the shores of Greece faded into the distance, along with everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Isef Aga, kept meticulous records: cargo, spices, coins, textiles, and religious captives. Centuries later, it was this very ledger, found in the Istanbul archives, that confirmed a story once dismissed as legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms battered the deck, salt stung their wounds, hunger hollowed their faces. But what broke them most wasn't pain, it was silence. No one spoke to them except to bark orders. They existed like ghosts, drifting between sky and sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms under her breath. Her voice was so faint it was almost lost in the crashing waves. Yet even the other chained prisoners, Greeks, Serbs, Italians, turned their heads to listen. For a moment, the sea itself seemed to pause. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rising before them, its domes and minarets glowing in the dawn. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, it would become their prison. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow streets, lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Locals stopped to stare. Christian nuns among the captives were a rare sight, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient walls of Blachanae toward the imperial district, where their fate would be decided. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, once the greatest cathedral in Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzin's call echoed from the minarets, one of the sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns. This wasn't a dungeon. It was the Divani Humayun, the imperial council, where the sultan's will was law. Here, captives weren't judged by kings or priests, but by the empire itself. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, his face unreadable. Scribes waited with ink and parchment, ready to record every detail. Names, ages, intended uses. Every word would be entered into registers that still survive, stained by wax and time. The sisters stood in their torn habits, eyes lowered. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy, on one condition. Those who converted would be given new names, food, and a place in the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean anything from imprisonment to disappearance. No one spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled. She had seen what happened to other captives, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Diris, stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had watched empires rise and fall. "My lord," she said, "you may rename us, but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate. When he did, the vizier's face didn't change. He replied coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a wave of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapı Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would call it mercy. Others would call it something far worse. Their new prison was a labyrinth of stone halls beneath the palace gardens, sealed from the sun. Each cell had a narrow slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were stripped of their habits, given rough clothes, and told they would now serve, cleaning floors, sewing garments, feeding fires for the upper chambers. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude. But the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger, cold, and solitude were nothing new. For them, Suffering was not punishment. It was devotion made real. Even in this underground prison, their discipline became their armor. At night, they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed. They began counting days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call, not out of conversion, but as a defiant clock for a faith that refused to die. Soon, whispers spread among the palace servants, stories of the silent sisters, foreign women buried beneath the palace who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed, others called them saints. Their silence echoed through the tunnels louder than any prayer. Days blurred into months. Their hands blistered from labor, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that warmed others, but not themselves. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed time and hunger would bend even the strongest faith. That's when the next test began, a trial disguised as mercy. First came kindness, food, oil, and silks sent to their quarters. Learned men from the palace came to speak gently, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. Your God and ours are not enemies, one imam said. Take our tongue, and you will be free. But the sisters knew what that freedom meant, erasing the memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and trembling, began to emerge as their strength. She whispered fragments of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept them alive. Even incomplete, the word endured. When persuasion failed, the masks came off, the torches were doused, food was cut in half. No more kind visits, only silence and darkness. One by one, they were taken to a narrow room where scribes waited. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused disappeared. It wasn't one grand act of cruelty, but a slow, methodical breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away by hunger, waiting, and the quiet voice that asked, "Why suffer for a God who doesn't answer?" A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who remained, each disappearance only hardened their resolve. Sister Dearest, once brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. "Call me Silence," she said. Her defiance spread like wildfire. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness, and in that stillness, they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken: control. Official records mention them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else, living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes, deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned. Within those forgotten corridors, the survivors found something unexpected, an old sealed archway buried in dust and stone. At first, it was just a hiding place, but slowly, it became something sacred. They used broken pottery for candle holders, a scrap of linen for an altar cloth. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross. In this secret chapel, they gathered each night after the palace slept. No hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman knelt and shared a memory, a home, a church bell, the warmth of bread before dawn. These memories became their new psalms, small offerings to a God who still listened in the dark. A Venetian prisoner once wrote of strange voices echoing beneath the harem, women singing in Latin to a god not of this empire. For centuries, historians dismissed it as superstition, until, beneath the Topkapı ruins, archaeologists uncovered a small chamber lined with Christian carvings, silent proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into the stone, a Latin phrase, half erased by time, lux, in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness. That small discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not simply vanished, they had left a mark, a silent revolt etched into the walls. Inside the hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once frail, now the center of their faith, began marking the walls with charcoal. Names couldn't be written openly, so she used symbols instead. A bird for each sister still alive, a small flame for those who had been lost. Whenever a new bird failed to appear, it meant another had disappeared. The guards never found the chapel, but they began to notice subtle changes in their captives. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the confinement, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. The overseers called it madness, but the scribes who watched them saw something else, a strength not of this world. Their secret worship continued for months, maybe years, and though the empire tried to erase every trace of their existence, the chapel became their ultimate act of defiance, not with weapons, not with protest, but with a faith that refused to die. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of the sisters remained, worn, aged, almost forgotten. Yet beneath the palace, their secret chapel endured, silent, hidden, eternal. Centuries later, when modern excavators explored Istanbul, no one expected that beneath layers of marble and empire, the fingerprints of these women would still be there. Women who had prayed in darkness, leaving behind the only thing the conquerors could never claim, their faith carved in stone. By 1482, the palace had changed hands again. A new sultan, young and ambitious, took the throne and ordered every servant, concubine, and laborer to be recorded, except for one group. In the Topkapı archives, under columns of names, there was a blank space, a gap where 21 entries should have been. The ledger read, unfit for service, disposed, no dates, no burial records, nothing. This was how history erased them. Not with fire, but with silence. And yet, the silence itself became proof. Only something shameful is hidden so carefully. Centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary surfaced in the archives of Bursa, cryptically mentioning foreign women who had refused to submit and disappeared beneath the palace. Another letter, intercepted by Venetian spies in 1484, spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, these fragments revealed a truth the empire tried to bury: the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. The last record of Sister Magdalena comes from decades later, written by an Italian pilgrim. He recounted a story whispered by a palace servant, a woman who sang to her god until the guards sealed the room. Her name was unknown, but the faint hymn he described seemed to survive in the very stones. Over time, tales of the vanished sisters became whispered rumors among slaves and servants. On certain full moon nights, the lower halls of the palace would grow cold, and the air would smell faintly of incense, though no fire burned. Memory, superstition, or both refused to die. Centuries later, European visitors drawn to the mysteries of the Ottoman court heard fragments of the same legend. A French diplomat writing in 1712 noted that among the older palace attendants, there persisted a forbidden story of Christian women who had sung themselves into heaven. He dismissed it as myth, but the walls had already told the truth. The chapel lies in ruins now, but the carvings remain, faded prayers etched into the stone, a whisper of women who refuse to be forgotten. In their silence, they still speak. If you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt as you listened to what they endured. And if you want more untold stories from the shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the darkness with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how hard the world tries to erase them.